Hello. Sorry for a bit late start, actually, after a couple of minutes, but I think we are still within the proper academic 15. And first of all, let me greet you all and a little bit of apologize that they are coming from our side. That I simply forgot that we are having the state non-working day, if I could say. We are having commemoration day today for the victory in the First World War. But actually, we were planning some other day, then there was some moving actually, and it came very convenient that we put it from 11th. So that's why we put that in the time when actually we should not be working. But on the other hand, I think we have enough, something like 20 people who are present now with us. And I think, as I see, quite a good audience. So without further ado, just let me start with a couple of notes with on our today's guest. Professor Philip Hammond is working at the South Bank University in London, and teaching basically communications, media, and as we put it in our announcement, he's mostly focused recently at the way media are being used, abused, instrumentalized, and so on. And we could, as you know, speak quite a lot about from our experience, even contemporary and historical one. And we really had the privilege of having him for several months in Serbia, where he's been conducting some private research for his future work. So we actually got the chance to have him as a lecturer and presenter today. And while we were speaking about, of course, I will ask him to give a couple more words on himself. And speaking about the possible issue and the subject we're going to speak about today, he was having plenty of, I might say, fantastic ideas. So I thought about offering him a course here, but I didn't want to torture him at the end. One of the ideas at that time was really how the media are being covering the whole COVID crisis, which was really very interesting. Again, very interesting issue concerning international relations, and the role of media was about Syria, when I think that he's going to write also something upon that. But actually, in the meantime, since we had recently this event in Glasgow, actually, Philip said, okay, let's be the actual and up to date. And he offered the title you could hear. So actually just put it precisely as he put it. The lecture is called Climate Change and Post-Political Communication. And once more, thank you very much for coming and being with us today. And please, the floor is yours.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Misha. And it's a pleasure to be here. I hope you can hear me okay. The sound coming through. If you would mind starting that presentation, then I can see what I'm doing. Here it comes. Will the people on Zoom be able to see that?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, good. So that's the title, and it's also the title of a book. I'm going to talk about some of the themes from the book. I should say that about 2/3 of that book is about the media, about 1/3 on news and journalism, and 1/3 on sort of celebrity and popular culture. But I decided that for the purposes of today, I didn't really want to get into all the detailed examples of media and celebrity. I'll mention those things, but it would be a bit dull if I had to kind of explain all the detail of the examples. So it's more a kind of high-level themes type outing today. That book came out in 2018, and as you no doubt know, the pace of academic publishing is quite slow. So obviously I wrote it before that. In that book, I think probably the most recent major policy development in relation to climate change that the book covers is the 2016 Paris Agreement. So things since that are not in there, but obviously quite a lot of important things have happened since 2016. And the discussion has changed quite a lot, and in particular, the political context in which the discussion of climate change takes place has changed quite a lot. So I'm aware of a kind of need to update a little bit, and I will try at the end towards the end of what I'm going to say today, to try and reflect a bit on that change and what's different now compared to 2016. Some things I think are the same. And then the third kind of caveat that I wanted to make at the start is that, of course, the book is it's basically kind of the focusing on the role of climate change as an issue, a public issue in Anglo-American politics. Britain, obviously the #1 focus, but quite a lot also about the USA. And I'm very curious to know from you how you think it compares to the discussion here. I'm aware that there is a discussion here of the environment and climate change and so on. From what little I know of it, it strikes me as a little bit different. But I sort of don't really know enough to judge it well. So I'm hoping that you will help kind of enlighten me about that when we get to the discussion. All right, so without further ado, if this will work. No, didn't work. It's annoying. It was working so nicely before. Okay, there we are. I think maybe the first thing I have to talk about is this concept of the post-political. And I think I guess there's two, I don't know if it's familiar to you at all, probably the most famous or well-known writer to discuss it is Slavoj Žižek. But there's two ways to approach it. One is, I think, for my purposes anyway, one is specifically in relation to environmental campaigning and climate change. The way I would look at it is that roughly by the middle of the first decade of this century, so round about 2006 onwards, there starts to be a dawning awareness among climate campaigners, some of them, that what they thought was the right approach in terms of campaigning doesn't seem to have worked out very well. What I mean by that is they took it it was broadly taken for granted that what you had to do was build consensus, to get everybody to agree, to marginalize or quash or deal with dissent and disagreement. And when Greenpeace in that image say stop the politics, that's kind of what they mean. Stop all the disagreeing, stop all the arguing, stop all the divisions of normal politics. We all need to agree. Well, by about that moment, the sort of 2006 to 2010 era, everyone did agree, more or less. You know, all the major political parties agreed. The media were on board. Lots of coverage, very supportive coverage in relation to climate change. Businesses, corporations, they were all signed up to a green agenda. Bankers, the royal family, celebrities, the Pope. You know, everyone was kind of on board with an environmentalist agenda. There was a very deep consensus and lots of attention being paid to the issue, and the very few sort of voices that didn't agree, you know, climate skeptics, climate contrarians, climate deniers, the way that they were discussed tells you how sort of marginal they were. They were kind of cranky holdouts, really, who were more or less marginal to the main discussion. And yet, by the time we got to the end of that decade, 2009, the Copenhagen Climate Summit, I think that was COP 15 can't remember. It seemed that all that kind of attention had produced not very much. There was not a lot to show in terms of action. So some people started to suggest, and especially people who were on the kind of more radical wing of the environmental movement, and who had hoped that, whoops, I went forward by accident, and who had hoped that, you know, that the issue of climate change, building consensus, would be a kind of focal point for political action to really sort of carry forward a deep and far-reaching social and economic transformation. They began to worry that perhaps the consensus building approach hadn't worked. Perhaps getting rid of the politics also somehow was getting rid of the motivation, the agency that needed for political action. So that's the first way you could look at it. And one of the most prominent critics in this regard is this chap I'm quoting there, Eric Svingadou, so radical geographer, saying that actually what sort of happens is that climate change becomes, because it's this issue around which we all agree, it almost seems like a barrier to taking decisive political action. And it's helping to just sustain this consensus and things carry on much as they were. The other way, maybe just to say, this is also about sort of environmental campaigners. The other thing to say maybe about that is that environmentalism as an issue perhaps is particularly prone to that kind of post-political outcome, precisely because it has that quality of the kind of ticking bomb. You've got to act now. You have to, it's urgent. We have to take action immediately. So therefore, there's no time for politics. So there's two kind of problems. One is that putting it above politics or beyond politics. Let's stop all the disagreement. And the other one is it's super urgent. We have to act immediately. So there isn't time for politics. Either way, people like this author, Andrew Broman, who was, his is a kind of insider's critique. He was involved in radical environmental protest groups and starts to worry that it's kind of proved ineffective by stressing the urgency, the kind of apocalypticism around climate change. You basically kind of foreclose the possibility of having any proper discussion of what kind of future you might want or not want. The other way of approaching this issue is of the post-political is to say that, yes, you can understand it specifically in relation to climate change, but also, of course, it relates to broader developments. And that's the bit that I'm kind of more interested in a way. You could see the whole kind of post-Cold War period since, you know, roughly the late 1980s through to, I guess, the Paris Agreement 2016, as sort of characterized by that, by post-politics, as I say, writers such as Zizek have argued. That's to say that the old frameworks of political engagement of left and right appear to have run out of steam. They don't really inspire people. There's not a lot going on in politics. A lot of issues, and the environment is one of them, seem to be kind of more or less taken out of what we had previously understood as the realm of kind of political argument and dispute, and are seen more in a kind of technical way. They're matters for experts, they're matters for scientists, they're matters for technocratic administration rather than political dispute. And that's a broader phenomenon. It's not just climate change that you could talk about in relation to that. That's a kind of, it's kind of characteristic of politics in the West during that period. I guess you could call it the kind of end of history period that follows the end of the Cold War. So as it happens, climate change arises as a public issue precisely at that moment, precisely at the end of the Cold War. Politicians start taking it up, mainstream politicians, I mean, start taking it up as an issue in the late 1980s, 1988. Mrs. Thatcher is the first to make a major public speech about the environment. Time magazine, that's the January 1989 edition, where they replaced their normal Person of the Year with Planet of the Year, Earth, obviously. And so that's the kind of context that I want to try and place this discussion into, this post-Cold War context. And I think that you could identify, I would identify anyway, three sort of problems that climate change then is used, not necessarily in a kind of cynical or instrumental way, but it's drawn upon in order to address these problems. The first one is that there is a felt absence of purpose, that up until the fall of the Berlin Wall, you know, there was a sense that you kind of knew what politics was about, you knew what the future might look like, you knew what the kind of horizon was, the goal was, the mission, if you like. You could articulate that in familiar left or right political terms. Once all that falls away, well, first begins to lose its attraction and then kind of collapses altogether. There's a kind of absence. There's a hollowness to Western politics, an absence of purpose and meaning and mission. I'll get back to that in a second. That's the first problem. I may need to convince you it is a problem, but I think it is. The second one is that in that same context, there is a hollowing out of politics in the sense that people are stopping participating. The numbers of people, for example, voting in elections declines. The number of people joining political parties declines. The number of people joining trades unions declines. The number of people attending church services, getting involved in charities, you know, any kind of public engagement, any kind of measure of it that you can think of, you see a decline as people kind of retreat to the private sphere and basically kind of lose interest, to all intents and purposes, in engaging in public political issues. And that is understood to be, at the time at least, it's understood to be a problem. And you start to get this discussion, which I'm sure we're kind of still familiar hearing about, of the democratic deficit. It's a democratic deficit because the demos, the people, are not engaged. And if they're not engaged, then it kind of calls into question the legitimacy of the elite, of the rulers, who seem to have not very much in the way of a mandate. That's the second problem. The third problem, which might not be quite so obvious, but I'm going to hopefully persuade you that it's the key one in a way, is that there is, underpinning this, there is a kind of diminished view of the human subject. Certainly the human subject understood as a political subject, a political actor. And I think environmentalism is actually quite important in that discussion, because environmentalism is inherently suspicious of that sort of modernist conception of the human subject as acting on the object world, the natural world, if you like. But that's a broader problem in this again in this era, a kind of anti-humanism, if you like. All right, so those are the problems, and I think that environmentalism arises, as I say, as an issue in just this moment, and is used to address those problems in various ways. The first one is that it produces basically a kind of ersatz form of political engagement, a kind of simulation of politics. So politics might not be working in the old way, but we can kind of pretend like it is. We can simulate it, and I'll show some examples of what I mean by that. Secondly, there is a shift, and environmentalism again is quite important in this. There's a shift in the way that people start to talk about political and public issues, from a more familiar left-right political framework kind of ideological framework, if you like, through to instead something much more emotional, perhaps even therapeutic, attempting to engage people on a different ground. And again, I'll give some examples. And the third thing, which again, as I've just indicated, environmentalism is very important to, is a kind of repudiation of the idea of modernist Enlightenment understandings of human subjectivity. That's to say, maybe it wasn't so great after all. We may have lost it, maybe it's not working, but is that such a great loss? Perhaps it was flawed to begin with. You might think of a writer like Bruno Latour in that context. We've never been modern, he says, in 1992. And turns out that he's a big fan of environmentalism. Who knew? So anyway, again, I'll give some examples of that. So that's kind of those three things is sort of what I want to talk about. And to take up the first one first, this point about the lack of mission, the felt absence of a kind of purpose for the political elites of Western countries. That is articulated very clearly, I think, by a number of important figures early on. One example is this book, which is by the Club of Rome. The Club of Rome, of course, very important in the founding of the contemporary environmental movement because of their 1972 book, The Limits to Growth. So they bring out a new book in 1991, and this is what they have to say about it. Oh, okay. I don't know if I'm, yeah, you may as well. Yeah, let's just, I may as well. I wish I hadn't done all these animations. They're annoying me now. I should have just had the lot there. Yeah, okay. So that's all of them. So, you know, the old ideologies don't work anymore. People are disengaged, they're indifferent, perhaps even hostile to main political parties. But maybe there's a solution. Perhaps we could mobilize people if we give them some kind of common cause, maybe a common enemy. And environmental problems like climate change could provide that, could provide a kind of enemy, obviously a metaphorical enemy, but an enemy nonetheless. And that will kind of rally people and resolve this problem of disengagement and a lack of purpose. They also add, maybe just worth noticing, that they also add this kind of anti-humanist note. The real problem is humanity as such. Mrs. Thatcher, I mentioned a few moments ago that she was the first mainstream political leader to publicly espouse a kind of environmental agenda, and it's usually that speech, the first one there. I can't tell if this is working or not, but okay, so the first one there, it was a 1988 speech to the Royal Society. It became a kind of famous speech just because she was the first person really to kind of articulate this. And again, maybe just worth noting in passing, the kind of, again, implicit anti-humanism that the real problem is just there's too many people. People often dismiss, because, you know, Mrs. Thatcher is perhaps an unexpected figure to be championing, can't pronounce that word, a green agenda. People often kind of try and downplay her significance and say, oh, you know, somebody else wrote the speech. It's not that big a deal. And if you just took that on its own, maybe you could say that's possibly true. But that's not all she did. In fact, she carried on making speeches about it, and her more important speeches really were in 1988, 9 and 1990 to the UN, and she had a very important role in establishing and then making permanent the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So she's also, I think, and I'll try and show an example of this later, she's also really the first mainstream politician that I can find anyway, who incorporates more than just a kind of light green environmentalism, but in fact into her politics, but in fact incorporates a kind of genuinely ecological perspective. There's a kind of genuinely deep green hue to some of the things that she's saying about the environment in that era in 1989 to 1990. And you can see in that speech to the UN there that she's very explicitly saying this is the solution to the post-Cold War drift. You know, it feels like, okay, we won, that's good, right? But now what? Well, one thing that's now what is tyrants and their tanks. And she was saying this in the autumn of 1990. Forget the exact date, but I think it was around sort of October, November 1990. Not long after Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait. So that's the tyrants and their tanks reference. And she's thinking there, like, how do we rally the world community to take collective action internationally, and obviously thinking preferably with a very important role for Britain as a permanent member of the UN Security Council. And it's environmental problems. That's what she alights on as the thing that's going to be the issue that will help to reorganize international politics in the new circumstances of the end of the Cold War. Not long after, just not much more than a year later, Al Gore made a speech accepting the nomination as vice presidential candidate for the American election, 92 election. And as you will perhaps expect, he makes a very similar point, that the environment is the key. For Mrs. Thatcher, it was the test, the thing that would test us. For him, it's the key organizing principle around which we can organize politics in the new circumstances that we find ourselves in. It's also maybe I'll just flag this up now, though I'll come back to it, that again, he sees this as something that's going to it's not just about the international sphere, although of course, you know, he wants to say that America will take the leading role in doing this. But it's also got a domestic payoff. It's going to inspire people at home. There's a kind of spiritual sickness, he says, in America, and this could help to resolve that. So again, it's about solving those problems at home. And he also very explicitly says it's not about politics. This is not a political issue, which is perhaps a surprising thing for a politician to say, making a political speech, looking for a political nomination. But there we are. It's not about politics, and I'll come back later to what he said it was about. But for now, that's the first point, that there is this kind of felt need at the end of the Cold War to find something new, a new thing to rally around, a new enemy perhaps to rally against, a new organizing principle, however you want to cast it. The second thing, if you recall, was this idea that the public are absent. The public are not engaging with the public sphere. And there is a kind of, I'm sure this will, I think it will sound familiar to you, that there is a kind of odd double way of thinking about the public in relation to an issue such as climate change. On the one hand, there's the idea, which is very common, that the role of environmental campaigners is to build a big movement, get lots of people on board, rally support, and that will then put pressure on politicians and governments to take action. So that's the kind of model, right? The bottom-up pressure. At the same time, if you listen carefully, there's also the precise opposite view of the role of the public. The role of the public is to be energized from the top down. The public aren't paying attention. They're not that interested. They're a bit apathetic. They're too keen on driving their cars and buying their consumer goods. We need to persuade them. We need to engage with them and put top-down pressure. Sometimes you find both views simultaneously within the same article. This is a recent example from environmental journalist George Monbiot, who writes for The Guardian. He was comparing which is a common comparison, incidentally. He's comparing climate change and the level of mobilization needed to the Second World War, and saying this time what we need is a kind of a mobilization to force the government to act. We need the big movement, bottom-up pressure from below. But then he also says we need something like the Office of War Information to persuade people top down that they ought to be doing that. So we have this weird situation where the way it's implicitly understood, sometimes explicitly like here, is that you need top-down information initiatives or perhaps media persuasion or something to engage people to then put pressure on politicians from the bottom up. It's an odd kind of circular argument. And it's that then leads to, as I said earlier, a kind of simulation of politics. This I thought was quite a telling example. It was, as I say, from the Copenhagen summit in 2009. This website, it was a campaign, it got loads and loads of publicity in the UK at the time. Act on CO2 Copenhagen. And it presented itself as if it was a kind of pressure group. It looked like it was a campaigning organization. We've got to act on CO2, and people were invited to pledge their support and sign up for an ambitious global deal to be negotiated at the summit. But in fact, the entire thing was a British government initiative. So they were campaigning for the public to put pressure on themselves. I mean, it's a weird kind of scenario where you have to persuade people to persuade you to act. It's like, well, why don't you just act then? What's the, you know? In fact, the government knew that a lot of people, as David Miliband's saying as much at the time, they knew that people weren't that engaged with the issue. Sure, there was a lot of agreement, but a lot of consensus if you poll people in opinion polls. But there certainly wasn't a kind of clamor of popular pressure for them to act in the way that they wanted there to be. So they just simulated it. It was another initiative from exactly that era. The Science Museum in London, a famous institution, had an exhibition about climate change called Prove It. And you were invited, if you went to the exhibition or if you went on the website for the exhibition, you were invited to sign up to the idea that you were convinced that this was a big problem and you wanted the government to get serious about it. But in fact, that was the Science Museum put that on because they realized that people weren't clamoring for action, and they did so at the prompting of the British government. So the government acted itself, and it also invited other institutions to act as if there was a big bottom-up campaign putting pressure on it. Kind of weird. I don't know if this, yeah, I don't know. We could watch this video if you like. It's about 4 minutes. Do you want to watch it? Do you want to just click that? This is a film made for that Copenhagen summit. If it runs, it's quite interesting. Let's take your life in your hands with you.
And few still doubt the impact of human influence over this predicted catastrophe.
Those activities which are emitting carbon dioxide are obviously imposing a cost on the earth, on humanity, on this generation and the next generation.
The number of environmental refugees to more than 250 million people. The shortage of resources and the high number of refugees will increase tensions all over the world.
scientific prognoses show that the continent of Africa will be severely hit if we do not act now.
Let us be clear. We are running out of time.
We would have hundreds of millions of climate refugees.
I'm only a child, yet I know we are all in this together. In my life, I have dreamt of seeing the great herds of wild animals, jungles and rainforests full of birds and butterflies. But now I wonder if they will even exist for my children to see. In my anger, I am not blind, and in my fear, I am not afraid of telling the world how I feel.
Please help the world.
Please help save the world!
Save the world. And they're going to say, of course, yes, it's okay. We've got a big climate summit. Of course, we'll save the world. There's a very interesting passage in that same Al Gore speech from 1992, where he basically outlines exactly that scenario. When he says it's not about politics, okay, so what does he talk about? What he actually talks about is in that speech, for a long stretch of it, is his personal family history, and specifically his experience of loss, of grief, of fear for his children, specifically his son. His son was involved in a road traffic accident and nearly died. And Al Gore talks in that speech a lot about what that was like, and describes himself, you know, staring into the eyes of his son, who's kind of gasping for breath. Will he take a breath? Won't he? And it's that kind of personal, emotional experience of suffering and near loss, near bereavement, that then he takes as giving him the kind of moral authority to act on climate change and to be a kind of guiding voice on the environment. And if you read, it's a bit long, I know, but if you read especially the second paragraph, that's exactly how he's placing himself in relation to the American electorate. The American people are like children lying in the gutter, wounded, like his son, struck by a car, except theirs is not a physical crisis, it's a spiritual, political crisis. And he's going to be like the parent, like the father he was to his son. He's going to help lift them from that and give them a kind of something to believe in, something to lift them out of themselves and carry them forward. So that's what I meant earlier when I was talking about the shift in the kind of the register, the language that's used in relation to, particularly striking in relation to the issue of climate change and other environmental problems, that rather than being about a sort of political discussion, it starts to become a very emotional, perhaps even therapeutic discussion about how do you feel, and the kind of personal feelings and emotions that you bring to the table. That's the thing that gave Al Gore, he thought, the authority, the license to speak out on the climate. A lot of people, maybe not a lot, but quite a few people at least, analyzing politics in that era, that decade that I was talking about at the beginning of the 21st century, start to notice this and start to say, well, maybe what's going on is a shift to a new form of governance rather than rational political arguments. It's more about some kind of emotional engagement. Barry Richards wrote that book, Emotional Governance, advocating for emotional governance, and we need more of it. The politician who he identified as doing it quite well was Tony Blair, He thought Bill Clinton was quite good at it too, but really he thought it was undeveloped. We need to engage people emotionally, perhaps in the same way that TV, soap operas or things like that might do. That's what's missing. So we can overcome the democratic deficit if we instead fill the emotional deficit in politics. And that's been a particularly, as I sort of indicated at the beginning, that's been a particularly important thing around environmental campaigning. One example is this. It's an American TV series, ran for 2 seasons. I think it started on National Geographic channel, Years of Living Dangerously, where they invited occasionally journalists, Thomas Friedman was one, but more often celebrities acting like journalists to go and travel and do fact-finding mission about different environmental problems. It's Jack Black on the boat there. He articulated the thinking behind this in a very clear way. You need, rational argument. Talking to people about the science is not enough. You need emotional engagement. And we know that. Why? We know that because we've been talking about all the rational arguments. We've been telling people about the science, and that hasn't really got us very far. So maybe what we need is a kind of emotional punch to really get people in the gut, and that will be the thing that engages them. And if you don't mind, I'll just take a brief, try and make it quick, a brief detour through the point about celebrity. That's obviously that series was all about celebrities leading the call for action on climate change. The role of celebrities, I think, in a way, you might think it's trivial, but in a way, I think it's quite important and eye-opening. Those images, the luxury brand magazine Vanity Fair, which is like the glossiest of glossy magazines with very high-end products advertised on its pages, started having an annual green issue a few years ago, and it was a very odd juxtaposition. Luxury consumption plus really you should consume a lot less and recycle more and that kind of thing. It seemed a bit of a jarring thing, and it led a lot of writers to kind of critique and try and understand the role that celebrities were playing in relation to climate change. And there was, people have developed, I think, quite good and sharp critiques of celebrity environmental activism, but they always end up kind of pulling the punch. They'll say it's terrible, it's kind of elite, top-down preaching by these, high energy lifestyle celebrities, but maybe it's okay. Maybe it'll be redeemable in the end. That's one example of someone arguing along those lines. There are many. This is another. Celebrities, in a way, are kind of helping to, in a sense, alienate people from politics. Or maybe you could take it, some people would argue that celebrities are another way, celebrity engagement is another way of simulating politics, in the sense that, the idea is that, it's never articulated explicitly, but the implied idea is that celebrities are popular. So if you've got a celebrity on board, well, this issue must be popular. But actually, no, it doesn't mean that. It just means you've got a celebrity on board. And in fact, when people have tried to research how far do celebrities really inspire their fans or audiences to engage with a public political issue, it's not that great. It's very, very patchy. Sometimes does, but more often people who are interested in celebrity are interested precisely because they're not interested in other stuff. They're not interested in the celebrity because of the political issues. They're interested because they like that celebrity, they like the music, or they like the films, or whatever it might be. So it's again a kind of simulation of popular engagement by having a celebrity on board. But again, Michael Goodman and co. Arguing that maybe it still might do some good if they're talking to other elite figures. And I think that that's the kind of, in a way, that's the most significant thing that celebrities do. They facilitate and perhaps even kind of dramatize the process of what one set of authors call elite to elite emotionally tinged communication. They wrote that, Julie Doyle and her collaborators wrote that, discussing Leonardo DiCaprio's film Before the Flood. I don't know if you've seen that one, but 2015, 16, I think that was. And that's how they characterize it. But actually, it could be much more widely applicable. You could apply it perhaps to the kind of event that image there is taken from, the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. I suppose they can't do it now because of COVID, but they regularly held a kind of annual gala, charity gala. I think they did it Saint-Tropez or somewhere. And, you know, it was a place where lots of celebrities and, you know, minor royalty and figures from the world of finance and banking and industry and so on would come along and donate money to the foundation. That's where that picture's from. It's got Bono on board as well. And it's really, you know, it's really in a way, more importantly, is the communication, the role of celebrities in communicating within the elite rather than actually engaging the public. So that speech there that I'm quoting, Leonardo DiCaprio's speech at the UN, you know, it's actually a very flattering thing that he's saying. He's addressing the kind of representatives of all the world's governments and saying, you are, as he puts it, the last best hope of Earth. I think he's paraphrasing Abraham Lincoln there. But, you know, it's a very flattering thing that you've got the famous, handsome Hollywood actor telling you that you're really important. We've got to, we put our trust in you to take care of the future for us. Also, maybe just worth noting in passing that you can still see in that quote there, the kind of thing that we're perhaps nowadays more used to hearing from Greta Thunberg. He's saying, you know, no more talk, no more blah, 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 as Greta puts it. Stop talking about it. Stop all the discussing, stop the politics, as Greenpeace put it. We need to just act. And then just finally, then moving on to the third thing I wanted to talk about, which is the kind of problematization, even perhaps repudiation of modernist conceptions of political agency. Perhaps it's not a surprise to find that a figure such as the Pope would take such a stance, you know, a kind of religious worldview saying, well, of course, for the Pope, it's not about politics, it's a moral and religious issue. But also kind of, you know, an idea that humanity perhaps shouldn't be too arrogant, should be a bit more humble, shouldn't be too sort of hubristic. That's kind of what he was getting at in his 2015 papal encyclical about the climate, which I'm sure you remember. That's not maybe such a surprise, but what I think is quite surprising is the range of people who agreed with him. Here's one of the ones that I found most surprising, Naomi Klein, who, you know, a bit of a kind of darling of the left, or at least some sections of the left, author of No Logo and The Shock Doctrine, and also of a book and documentary film about climate change called This Changes Everything. And Naomi Klein, you know, is a left-wing, secular, Jewish feminist. The last person maybe you'd think would be on board with the Pope. And yet here she is saying, great, you know, what the Pope is saying, it sounds really kind of right and appealing. He's reminding us that we are not God, and it would be arrogant of humanity to put itself in, to act in a kind of godlike fashion over nature. In other words, to adopt that kind of Enlightenment modernist subjectivity, which says human reason is such that we can shape our own future, shape our own destiny, use science, use technology to intervene in the object world. And so the thing that she likes about the Pope's message is effectively he's downplaying the importance of that, and the reference to Descartes I think is telling there that it's the whole history since the Enlightenment of modernist thinking that she is unhappy about. Very similar views. Again, it might be a bit of a surprise, but then we are very similar views from Mrs. Thatcher. And this is what I would kind of thing I was getting at when I said that you can find in her speeches from, towards the end of her own political career, but the beginning of political engagement with climate change, you can find genuinely kind of ecological themes. That's the kind of thing that she was saying, we used to believe in progress. We used to believe in the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, the age of science and technology. Now we don't like that anymore. We don't believe that anymore. We've realized that was too kind of hubristic. We need to scale down our ambitions. So, Mrs. Thatcher on, I guess, the right of the political spectrum of left and right, as was, or Naomi Klein on the left, or indeed Al Gore. And when I was thinking and writing about this kind of thing, my initial understanding of it was, and I kind of talked about it in these terms at the beginning, my initial understanding of it was that this was a kind of problem, that the undercutting the idea of political agency is a problem if you're trying to mobilize people for political action. But how can you, it's very difficult to see how you could square that circle and do both things at once. It's kind of gradually dawned on me, a bit slow on the uptake, but it's gradually dawned on me that actually what is appealing to many of the key sort of figures in this debate is precisely the powerlessness. It's the lack of agency that is seen as the good thing. That is in fact taken as the positive. So again, a bit of a long, this is from the book version of An Inconvenient Truth. And yeah, the bits in italics there, you can see him kind of talking about how important it's going to be to give us a sense of mission, a sense of purpose. It's going to bring people together and it's all about agency, isn't it? It's all about, actually, no, if you, try and click for me if you would. If we'll add maybe it's going to sleep. That's it. Yeah. So adding my own emphasis to it, actually, the thing that he finds thrilling is being forced to do it. It's being forced to act. It's the fact that he has no choice. That's what he thinks is the good thing. So it's not, what appears to be about political mobilization and what we might think of as political agency, actually it's the opposite. It's appealing precisely because we don't have, there is no argument to be had. We're forced to do this. And quite a similar sentiment from Naomi Klein. We have to give up the fantasy of power and control, she says. That's the power, the Enlightenment era ideas about power and control, like Francis Bacon's ideas about science. That's all mistaken. Instead, we need to embrace and kind of enjoy, in a way, giving in to our loss of control, our lack of mastery. In other words, you could say, and I would suggest that it's her title, Naomi Klein's title, this changes everything. It's kind of another way of saying what Mrs. Thatcher famously said at the end of the 1980s, there is no alternative. There's no choice. There's no political argument to be had here. There's only one thing we can do. So let's just get on board and do it. There is no alternative but to act. So, rather than as the kind of environmental critics who start, around the time of the Copenhagen summit, I guess around that era, start to think maybe there's a problem with climate change being understood and discussed as a post-political issue. it's kind of closing down what we thought would be a kind of movement for radical social and economic change. In fact, the significance of it is not that it does that, but it offers something that you kind of just bypasses politics. That's in a way the advantage of it, that you don't need to engage people in that sense. In the period that I've been talking about, the kind of post-Cold War period, the 1990s, the first decade of the 2000s, it seemed as if there was this attempt to kind of rally the public, rally Western societies. And I think it was a genuine thing. I'm not saying it was, you know, an illusion. I think they really were trying to do that, to rally against a kind of common enemy. But as time has gone on, that using the issue to engage the public in that sense, I think has become less and less significant. More and more significant is the role of the issue of climate change within elite circles, almost as a kind of marker of elite virtue. So if you think about the imagery around COP26 now in Glasgow, you know, even just before that, Joe Biden's massive motorcade, you know, 85 vehicles, all the hundreds of private jets flying into Glasgow. Jeff Bezos, who just came back from space to tell us about climate change, having a tete-a-tete with Prince Charles, who, you know, said helpfully that he has decided that he will use his leftover white wine to run his Aston Martin. Thank you for that environmental tip. You know, it's like a kind of performance, you know, it's a kind of, and the importance of climate change in a way as a kind of cohering issue isn't so much to cohere everybody else, it's to cohere the elite within themselves. And that's why you see these kind of displays. It just so happens that it was a very public one, but they also do it privately. You might remember this from 2019, I think it was, the Google Climate Camp, not a public event, although it became, you know, publicized. This one in a very expensive resort in Sicily, organized by Google, brought together campaigners and scientists and business people, especially from the kind of new business elite of Silicon Valley and so on, together with lots of celebrities, and Prince Harry was on hand to give us a talk about environmentalism. Again, of course, lots of private jets, and in that instance, lots of massive yachts, massive super yachts sailing to Sicily. So, you know, they're kind of doing this even when no one's particularly watching. You know, that's how they roll. It's an issue for intra-elite cohesion and a marker of elite virtue. And you could possibly extrapolate that to the international sphere, that there are certain nations who are virtuous and there are certain nations who are not virtuous. So China, for example, is a massive international sinner when it comes to climate change, even though in fact they didn't attend the Glasgow summit, but they did announce that they're building hundreds of nuclear power stations, which probably do a lot more for mitigating climate change than the talk at Glasgow. But there are, nevertheless, there are clear kind of lines of who's in, who's out. I think that the shift that I've just mentioned, that shift to being less about engaging the public, more about a kind of intra-elite issue. I think that's something that's become more apparent since 2016. And the big change since 2016, of course, maybe not of course, but in my mind, of course, is populism. In a word, I mean, yes, before 2016, but in Britain, it's 2016, because that's the date of the Brexit referendum. And things like that. So popular parties in Greece or in Spain before that, or the Trump election around about the same time as that, you know, big political upsets where the public, far from the problem being that the public are not engaged enough, oh my God, they're too engaged. There's too much bottom-up participation in politics. So now when it comes to an issue like climate change, the instinct is we're just going to impose a policy. We're just going to say what the policy is. We're not going to try and engage you in a conversation about it. Here's the policy. You don't need to discuss it. So for example, in Britain, 2019, the UK government announced its net zero targets for 2050. I think it's actually come closer than that now, but they initially announced it as a target would be 2050. And they did so not through any kind of democratic process. It wasn't part of a political manifesto or program that anybody voted for. It was a target that was recommended by a quango, a quasi-autonomous non-governmental body, the Climate Change Committee, which was established not by the current government, by the Labour government actually in 2008. So this committee, unelected committee, comes up with a recommendation. You should set a target of net zero by 2050. Politicians take that and say, right, we've got to act on this. It's signed into law within a matter of weeks with zero debate and zero public deliberation. Well, it's maybe today it's harder than it was in the not too distant past. It's harder than it was to just bypass the democratic process. People will sit up and notice. Might think of the Gilets jaunes in France, when they try to regulate the price of diesel, for example. Or here, where people in Britain, this is from the British government's own website, where it allows people to petition on different issues. And if you get more than 10,000 signatures, the government promises it will respond. If you get more than 100,000, it promises it will debate the issue in Parliament. So people immediately this has started a few days ago in response to the Glasgow Climate Summit. People said, well, we should have a referendum. We should have a vote on this. And the government said, don't be silly, we're not going to have a vote on this. And so people started a petition to argue for it. That's that's a screen grab from a couple of days ago. So the number will be a bit more now, but it's already over the 10,000 threshold for being discussed in Parliament, which is kind of interesting. So it's kind of harder in a way now. It's not so much a case of simulating public engagement, pretending that the public are on board. It's kind of thinking of ways that you might actually bypass the public and just get policy there without having to engage the public at all. And one important way nowadays, I think, to do that is via what I'm referring to there as nudge messaging. I'm kind of assuming you're familiar with the idea of nudge. I've got some nods. An idea, it's a kind of idea from that draws on behavioral science, behavioral psychology, elaborated by Thaler and Sunstein in their book Nudge. But it means kind of using kind of subtle persuasive means to kind of shape the messages that are available to people, the range of ideas that they're likely to encounter, and to kind of shape what they call the choice architecture. So you could think of it in terms of, this is about the media, but you think in non-media terms, if you go to a supermarket or you go to a coffee shop, let's say, and the brand that's on offer in front of you, the one that you see is the fair trade, sustainable, eco-friendly coffee. Well, that's the one you're going to buy, right? Or you go to the shop and you say, can I have a plastic bag? And they say, well, you're going to have to charge you for it now. Those kind of things. So little subtle nudges to say, you should think like this. You should think like that. You should behave in this way. So that's the kind of, and people have written quite a lot about how this has played out in relation to COVID messaging as well, incidentally. But in relation to the environment, this is a new report that's been put out by the Behavioural Insights team, which started as the Behavioural Insights unit at the UK Cabinet Office. So it was an internal UK government thing to start with. It's still the Cabinet Office still has a share in it, but it also operates as a kind of private business now. And it was commissioned to write this report by the British satellite broadcaster Sky News. And basically what they're doing is giving advice on how to, as they put it there, to kind of bypass disagreement. So, if we work through messaging in the news rather than just reporting the news, we're going to use the news as a vehicle for persuasion, for getting people to think in a certain way. But we can also use other things. We can use fiction, we can use TV dramas, we can use comedies, we can use sitcoms, we can use a full range of programs and advertising and everything around the program as well. We can use social media in order to keep getting these messages across. And it's interesting that you can see in that quote there, that they're thinking about how to kind of have such content that is so kind of immersive that people forget that they disagree, that you'll persuade people even who didn't agree with the proposition to start with. They'll kind of go along with it, and they'll kind of won't question it. Another related suggestion is to use, oops, I was already there, is to use children's programming. So get to the kids, and you can thereby get to the parents. Of course, kids are far less likely to argue because they're kids. So you wall-to-wall messaging in the kids programs, and then they will nag their parents to adopt the right ways of thinking. And to my mind, I don't know what you make of that. I think it's quite disturbing. Actually, it's quite sinister. If it is people, a lot of people at least, kind of seem to think this is okay. Obviously, Sky thinks it's okay. They're publicizing this. They're not trying to hide it. They think this is a good thing because I suppose it's in what they think is a good cause. But regardless of the cause, actually, it's a kind of a sinister thing. They just try and say, well, we're going to use all kinds of media we can think of to essentially manipulate people into thinking a certain way about this issue. So again, at least nowadays, and maybe wasn't quite the same in the recent past, but now I think it's quite clear that it's not really about engaging the public at all. It's more about simply setting the policy and then manipulating people to agree with it. You might call it manufacturing consent. All right, and that, Tom.
Okay, I will go back there. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. A lot of material, a lot of the things that we follow actually a little bit from a side, if I may say, because as you mentioned, it's not so dramatic issue here. We still have like classical, let me say, more hardware than these kind of software problems that are dramatically dominating in the West nowadays. But it was more than illuminating to follow the way debate is going on, or how we are changing the politics, and we will go into debate, but a lot of those things concerning the mechanism and techniques that are being used remind us very much to the good old communism, but much more subtle than this is, as you say, like manufacture consensus and many of the things that we know. Mm-hmm. So in any way, I think we have some hands here, and I'm sure that they will be at the chat as well. So let's start with the people I see here. Okay, I saw Jovica first. No, of course, please.
Okay, my name is Jovica Pavlovic from the Institute of European Studies here. Well, thank you very much for a very inspirational lecture. Basically, what I think, I didn't expect to get this, but what we got was an unpacking of a road to the polarization within Western societies that we have today, because you explained how since the end of Cold War, there was this shift from trying to engage the public and then trying to disengage it from being engaged too much by using this particular very interesting issue that was the rallying point in the 90s. And then you explained how it came to the nudging at the end, which is why, at least I conclude, many people revert from being nudged, while many more still are trying to act within this narrative. Oh, we should do this. This is good for the climate. And then you basically what you end up with is a polarized society where half of the people instinctively recognize that something is being done subtly underneath the surface, and they can't unpack it as you did today, but they can feel it, that they're being nudged in this sense, and it gets irritating after a while half of the people are still compliant. They have, maybe they're satisfied personally, they have good jobs, the system is doing them well, so they don't really care that the product is being placed in front of them, since they have the money to buy it, right? So they don't care who places the product or for what purpose. So I think that underneath this lecture, we got a really good explanation of how it came to, let's say, Brexit and to Trump, with the society feeling that first it was being, and I'll keep this short. So first it was being rallied behind the point, which was basically rallying against itself, because rallying against the Red Scare, you know who the enemy is, and you're affirming your identity by rallying against the Red Scare, against Russia or the Soviet Union. But now, like in the 90s, as you explained with Al Gore, you have to rally against yourself because you're the problem. And you don't want to look at the mirror anymore because you're not Captain America anymore. Now you're this like greedy capitalist who's destroying the environment. And for some people, that's okay. They're going to say, okay, we need to work on ourselves. But many people are going to say, I don't want to look at this mirror, so I'm just going to ignore this system that is being pushed upon me. And I think that's where the divide actually happened. And I haven't thought about it like that before this lecture. And just to revert quickly to our situation here, because you asked about that, it's not, as in everything, we're kind of reacting to what is happening in the West. And what I see happening here, particularly within the last 2 or 3 years, so very recent development with this talk about the environment and stuff, is that many parties are trying to rebrand themselves to this issue, which was like unheard of. Like 5 years ago, nobody would care about the environment. Let's say the Belgrade waterfront project and the Ne davimo Beograd, the organization that tried to stop it. So basically it's unstoppable now, it's half done. So they're trying to rebrand themselves now as an environmental movement, and they're even changed their logo, and they're talking more and more about the environment and less about the actual project and the city management, which was their primary point of, yeah. So I think that what is happening here is that small political parties are catching up to the fact that this might be the next way in to foreign funds, to, you know, more votes, because the main political sphere is closed, the main media is closed. So this kind of seems like a potential way inside the political sphere. Okay. So 2 comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. That's really interesting. I don't know what to say in response. I sort of agreed with your characterization. I could say a bit more about the thing that you mentioned, the kind of how it relates to other kinds of political polarization, but maybe I should hold back for now and take a couple more if you want.
I see 2 hands more. Just you have to come to the mic here, please. So Irina and then Uroš.
Thank you, Mr. Hammond, for your lecture. And I'm Irina Martinovic from this institute, and I also want to thank you for your intellectual efforts to present our Balkan wars in a more objective way within the Western public and the scientific discourse. When it comes to your today's topic, what do you think? How to treat serious global problems optimally, but avoiding traps of misusing the media and other kinds of instrumentalization in a post-political communication era? Thank you.
Are you basically asking how it should be done? I've criticized how it is done. Are you asking how I think it should?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. It's not. I don't think it's like you could, turn a switch and do it properly. I am very unhappy with the idea of being nudged, so I think they should stop doing that. I think that they should drop the emotional appeals and engage people in a rational political discussion. That's much better. I think that people should be allowed to have a say. Maybe it's a referendum or maybe it's something else, but actually engaging the demos is a good thing if you want to claim to be a democracy. But that's just like in principle what should happen. The other thing you could say in principle is that environmental issues and the climate as the preeminent one among them, it would be great if it wasn't politicized, if it was, the science and the politics could be disentangled so that the politicians didn't rely on the authority of science and the scientists didn't try and, politicize the science and give the kind of correct messaging. I think both sides have, politicians probably more than the scientists, but both sides have contributed to a kind of horrible muddying of where does science end and politics begin. And that's been the case for a long time. So again, like in principle, I don't think that's about to happen. Perhaps a more practical thing that you could think in terms of how to take this forward in a more positive way would be to say, kind of stop, if we could just get away from the preachiness to people about their consumer lifestyles and you should fit the energy saving bulbs. You should not use the plastic bag. You should do the recycling. All those kind of silly lifestyle issues, which are very, very tiny, small scale things. And instead think in a much more rational way about environmental problems and how to solve them. So as I mentioned, nuclear power, for example, it's telling, I think, astonishing that most green campaigners, there are exceptions and some do embrace nuclear energy, the vast majority of them don't. And even though that would in fact, solve the problem that they say that they're addressing. So a bit more of an open mind about what the solutions could be and seeing it as a problem that could be solved. I think at the moment that people don't, in a way, want it. You could say you don't even really want it to be solved. They want it to be a thing that helps to regulate people's everyday lives, which personally I find objectionable, but there we are.
What is interesting here, actually, in Serbia, just to add it before I pass the floor to our colleague, actually, that we are also yesterday. So, for example, at the same time that Emmanuel Macron publicly came out with the idea that within next, I don't know, several years, they will initiate a new program with building more of nuclear power plants, actually, because he sees that as a major contribution of France to the ecology in the future, And the same argument you can hear in Serbia in the last, I don't know, 15 days, actually, last month, when after, I don't know, very long time, for the first time, we saw from the, up to the bottom approach, politicians and some prominent, let me say, public figures that are connected with the regime also came out with the whole idea that, okay, for the time being, we have to use coal, but we will work to eliminate that by joining, for example, the project in Hungary or in Belene in Bulgaria and so on, which is a very interesting way to contribute to the ecological fight in the future. Our colleague Uroš Čemalović, please.
So Mr. Ivan Dujic asked two questions. The first one would be, is the environmentalism a new dogma for international relations? And the second one would be, are environmental issues the foundation to the UK's post-Brexit foreign policy?
A new what for, say that last bit again, sorry. A new what for the post-Brexit?
The second question.
Yeah.
Are the environmental issues the foundation to the UK's post-Brexit foreign policy?
Yeah. Well, okay, so possibly, at least they might want it to be. I think that if you look at the way that the UK government has tried to promote itself through the fact that it's hosting the COP26 in Glasgow, it certainly seems to want to make it an important plank of post-Brexit foreign policy. And of course, as I indicated, it has a kind of important international dimension, this whole discussion of climate change. How far it's a new dogma, that's quite a good way of putting it maybe, for international relations. I sort of think, I mean, I introduced this thing in what I was saying about the search for a new focus for international relations after the Cold War, search for a new sense of mission and purpose. I think that, as you could tell from the things that, say, Al Gore or Mrs. Thatcher or others were saying almost immediately at the start of that period, the environment has been present all along, but it does kind of wax and wane. It kind of comes and goes. Sometimes it's more important than others. Right now, it's a real big focus of attention. How far it carries on being such, I think, will possibly depend mainly on how far it's useful for Western governments in regulating development in the non-Western world and relating to non-Western powers such as China and Russia. And I think a lot of the discussion about coal, you know, is so, you know, when it comes to the European Union, they're very unhappy with, you know, coal or gas. In fact, even though gas, you could say natural gas is not really a big issue when it comes to climate change. But nevertheless, they're unhappy about it, probably because it's a relationship that Serbia has with Russia, rather than necessarily strictly about energy policy or climate change. There has been, as it's waxed and waned, I would say that the other big issue over the period since 1990 has been, apart from the environment, has been actually humanitarian intervention. It's been forms of war making that offer a sense of new purpose and mission. And in the 90s, that was certainly more important than the environment. I think that probably since the Iraq War, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, you know, that's much harder argument to make now. I don't think it's gone away completely, and I wouldn't rule out that it's going to come back. But for the minute, the environment is a much more, I think, important focus. So the answer would be yes, at least for now. And I also think it does relate very much, as you, I thought it was a very insightful comment, you know, about how it relates to the kind of dynamics within Western societies and that kind of polarization. I think that's also a reason why it might carry on being important, not just the international dimension. Do we have any more?
Mr. Alex Cameron applied for the speed.
Hello. Before I kind of make a point, I'd like to say how amazing that a man from Glasgow in Scotland who lives in Madrid is speaking to people in Belgrade. It is just beautiful. How good is humanity? I think lots of people listening to Professor Hammond's lecture will take different things from it. But this is what I'm taking from it. What's new? What is a continuation of the past is a useful question, I think. The establishment, the elite, the political elite, their impulse to cajole and control political discourse and the public is as old as the 20th century. But what is new, as far as I understand from what Phil is saying, that needs to be reckoned with, is the estrangement of the public for the political process. In other words, hitherto, people, the public, being involved in the democratic process seemingly just doesn't exist to the degree that it once did. So it's probably no great surprise that the elites have taken on a new purpose and are attempting to not engage with the public by any stretch of the imagination, but rely on more cajoling, more nudge, and more telling the public how they would think. So for me, that's what I'm going to take away from today, that what's different now is the public's relationship to the political process. It's not good news, but there are examples internationally where the public seemingly is trying to reassert itself.
Yeah. Right. Yes, I agree with that. I think put it very well, better perhaps than I did. You, Misha, compared it to what I was saying at the end there about nudge. You sort of compared it to, you know, the communist era propaganda. The parallel that springs to my mind, actually, and that's why I threw in the phrase manufacturing consent at the end, the parallel that springs to my mind is the kind of early 20th century. I don't want to suggest it's a, you know, you always lose as much as you gain when you make those historical comparisons. So I'm not saying it's exactly the same, of course not. But there are some more similarities today than there were maybe 10, 15 years ago. So the way I would look at it is like this. 100 years ago, you had the problem that people were thinking about in relation to politics and the media and democracy was how to deal with mass participation in the public sphere, right? So you think about somebody like Walter Lippmann, who comes up with that phrase, manufacturing consent, or Edward Bernays, father of public relations, who comes up with this very similar idea, engineering consent. The reason they're worried about that and the reason they're thinking about that and making those suggestions is because a new mass constituency is active in politics in unpredictable and volatile ways, and from their perspective, at least from the perspective of, you know, elite leaders or thinkers about these issues, or people engaged in either journalism or public relations like Lippmann and Bernays were, it looks potentially very worrying. You know, you've just had the experience of the First World War, and even as that was happening, you've had a revolution in Russia. You've nearly had a revolution in Germany. You've got mass communist parties springing up here, there, and everywhere. It looks like, you know, things could get very out of hand. How do we integrate people into the democratic process? And essentially, you know, what Bernays comes up with the idea of, let's use psychology, not a million miles away from let's use nudge. It's now behavioral psychology. Bernays, it was Freudian psychoanalysis, you know, but it's let's use some manipulation of the public mind through clever communications techniques. Lippmann, you know, perhaps a little less sanguine about that than Bernays was, but basically arguing we have to make sure that he says, you know, democracy is not a kind of small town hall meeting anymore. It's a great big thing with millions of people involved in it. We need to make sure that the people with the knowledge, the experts, the scientists, they're making the decisions. And then we'll use the media to manufacture consent for those decisions. And then that way people will not upset the political apple cart. So the problem they're grappling with is how do you contain and manage mass democracy. By the time you get to the 1990s, and the public are disengaging from the public sphere, it's more about how do you manage the absence of the public, the democratic deficit, how can we overcome that? Now, maybe just the last few years, we're perhaps a little closer than we were to the situation 100 years ago, where I'm not, of course, suggesting that contemporary populist movements are like the Bolshevik Party or anything like that. But I am suggesting that there is signs of political upset and political unpredictability and volatility, that the instinctive response is to think of the elite is to think, how do we manage that? How do we contain that? How do we, if you wish, manufacture consent to the policies that we're going to have? The new factor also perhaps now is that, as you rightly said, is the kind of interesting new polarizations. We could talk about that all day, probably. I'll stop.
I have a couple of issues. Okay, we are still good with time. So many things we really could use for the further development, and I was really having a lot of thoughts and comparison and analogies coming to my mind during your presentation, but I will try to focus on several. First one info, just you have some interesting phenomena which is called the Park of Friendship, where you have the tree planted by Miss Thatcher, actually, because that was at that time that I think they started from 60s. We had really, it's very interesting. We have at least 3 American presidents that planted their trees there, and this is concrete contribution of Miss Thatcher to the ecological movement that we still preserve in Belgrade, which is interesting. But speaking about concrete stuff, first, when you look at the discourse that Gore especially was using with epitome and so on, I recently saw some analysis speaking about ecologism in a way, on environmentalism as a kind of new religion. The way it is really presented, it's very emotional. It's, as you put it very rightly, we should not put everything in our mind. We should insist on emotion, on trust, on faith in our future, and use that, which is very interesting how you develop them politics. And you spoke quite a lot about that. They are simply trying to avoid the classical liberal democracy approach to the subjectivization, in which we all know that, of course, we don't have kids born with the whole capacity, but everything that we were doing with our society's family education, trying to really subjectivate them, to develop their subjectivity and capacity for the participation, to think about their, use their mind and so on. You see that it's going into different way, and the word or the concept that I'm having in mind is paternalism, actually. What really strikes me, and more than everything in contemporary Western world, and it's of course coming to my country as well, it's paternalism. That you exactly it's the model in which okay, we will tell you, as Bernard said, I will tell you what you should think, what you should feel, what you want to buy, what you do, and so on. And I'm afraid that we are having the political and global and especially financial elite, which is much more important than even political, which we saw from Twitter and Trump relationship, which is taking that for granted, that we don't have to develop political democratic participation with the classical cleavages and fights for that. It's too dangerous. We don't need that, and we will maybe use ecological issue to suppress all of that. And what is you probably are familiar with the documentaries of Adam Curtis. His several of the last are really going into that direction, like hyper normalization, especially this last 6-volume serial, I Can Get You Out of My Mind, which is brilliant and showing actually how we came to, as he is saying, that the elite is obsessed with, let me say, governability in a way, manageability. Okay, we can't anymore control the situation. We're obsessed how to keep that under some kind of, I don't know, control, especially with emotions. And so we simply cannot allow democracy anymore, because when we allow that, it's become too dangerous, like in 2015, 2016.
Mm-hmm.
So I would like to hear your comments upon that. The second issue, there is, but maybe one indication that there are maybe the first public and political results of, let me use that as a ecological ideology that is pushing in the Europe. You had a couple of years ago a lot of marches, especially in Berlin, in Germany, but other countries as well. When you have a lot of course, after Greta initiation and so on, but you could have a bunch of them having every Friday, and so on. And we saw that after a long time, you again have green parties as an important political factor. They will probably be very important part of new German government, probably having foreign affairs in their hands and so on. That we are still having Greens in Austria after FPO, which is very interesting, how they switch the agenda. They are important in France, even in Britain and so on. So maybe we are seeing the first, let me say, indication that it is going into some kind of the relatively massive political phenomenon or movement, especially engaging a lot of young people and so on and so on. And I'm finishing with small remarks about Serbia as well, since you asked for that. This was not the issue, as Jovica explained very well, until, I don't know, 4 years maybe and so on. Why it is becoming an issue here? First, concerning the government, we have a political president, leader of the party, everything, who is using all the discourse without any real substantial, how should I say, interest in them, and he can pick up, like today, he's using very strong nationalistic terms if it's necessary. Tomorrow, he is for LGBT issue and passing the very radical law on gender equality, which is very fundamentalistic and so on. He was 1 month ago in Budapest with Orban and defending family, all the same. And he was in Glasgow, of course, one of the most prominent environmentalists and so on. So concerning the public issue, we could use that whenever it's necessary. But what is really striking as a news is that you had local problems that really initiated, let me say, grassrooted riot of the people. It was happening especially in the south of Serbia. It's Stara Planina, Old Mountain, where you have a lot of these initiatives for small power plants, hydro power plants that are really ruining one of the most beautiful part of Serbia, but also completely devastating the land and the soil that people are using for their life. So that's when some people, some new activists came out together with local people and they managed to stop that. Somehow that was a concrete problem. And now we have another one, you probably heard, for Rio Tinto issue in Serbia. That's becoming big issue on which some political parties also try to build. Maybe there are some popular problem, but we have really big problem because it's really one of a couple of the most beautiful and pretty inhabited part of Serbia and Western Serbia. And now you see some public mobilization in Belgrade, in Novi Sad, local people who are really trying to build something on that issue. These are really, still we don't have political, because we don't have politics in Serbia nowadays, only small political parties, not even one of them is able to really cross the census line, but you see even some moves of coalition. That's going to be the big issue in the future, definitely. So even Vučić had to address that in some way and still waging how big problems he might have. And why also is the big issue? Because China is present here, investing in probably they should build a new thermal power plant with coal and so on. And of course, West is very unhappy, like with Russian gas. So Nord Stream is acceptable at the same time when South Stream was not acceptable and so on. But the Chinese, who are really becoming more and more important here because they control two biggest industrial issues or mining issues in Serbia, which are really the half of Serbia is depending on that. So they are coming out more with political statements which they have never done, like for 3-4 years ago. Very clear statement on Kosovo, Republika Srpska, and so on. And of course, we got bigger interest of some Western Stiftungs and foundations who are starting to fund. We had very successful local initiatives in Novi Sad, for example, which was very interesting. And of course, in some NGOs who are very soon, I got the invitation for big conference organized by some of our colleagues on China energetic resonance and the problems and so on. So it's becoming geopolitical issues. So that's, I think, suddenly we got to hear much more about the environmental issues. Thank you.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that's something to kind of watch for in the future. And I'm certainly going to try as best I can to keep an eye on it, how far those, kind of local, one would hope that it wouldn't happen, but I could see that there would be a risk that kind of local attempts to address immediate environmental issues or problems or challenges could quite easily get bound up in these bigger political processes and become kind of distorted in the process of doing that. I think that, that maybe relates a little bit to the question that you posed about whether it's comparable to religion. I think, people often say it's like a kind of new religion, and you can sort of see the parallels in many ways. I was particularly emphasizing the kind of more humble view of humanity, a reversion to a kind of pre-enlightenment view of the subject. So you could maybe say that's a kind of slightly has echoes of religious sensibility. Also the attempt to kind of, a lot of talk about the apocalypse and the apocalyptic future has a kind of religious undertone, quite often explicitly religious undertone. Although you'd have to say it's a kind of religion without transcendence. It's an apocalypse to nowhere, as it were. Nothing happens after it. So in that sense, it's kind of limited as a kind of religious thing. In a way, I guess it's. You could say it also maybe the most interesting, in a way, religious aspect of it, or the parallel to religion, is when people say, "Do you believe in climate change?" It's like it's a question of faith or something. It does kind of work in that way, as if almost like a kind of totem or a shibboleth or something like that. It's like a kind of, what sort of person are you? Whose side are you? Are you one of the good people or one of the bad people? And that, as
like with COVID. Do you believe?
That's right. And relating back to what you, I thought very insightfully said at the beginning, that there are people who kind of, kind of aware of that and resent it. I think I'm one of them, and don't like being nudged and don't want to be compliant. And at the moment, there isn't, or at least it remains so far unclear how. There isn't a kind of way to politically articulate that discontent, or it's not fixed. It's kind of fluid, and it seems to.
That's why it's so called populist.
Yes.
Because they use that discontent to articulate it.
Yes, and it's kind of unpredictable and fluid. I think that the paternalism that you spoke about. I think that That's very true. It's certainly present. I think that it's been revealed by populism in effect. You know, if you think certainly about the British experience, you know, for years, a good sort of 15, 20 years before Brexit, all the communications efforts were geared up encouraging people to vote. You know, you must vote. Why don't you want to vote? Why aren't you voting in elections? Get the vote out was the big campaigning thing. Well, then the vote came out, right? And what did everyone say? Then they turn around and say, I'm not like that. You know, no, you all voted the wrong way. You didn't know what you were doing. You saw a bus. You know, you know, it's all kind of. So that's when it was kind of revealed, that underlying paternalism, which wasn't perhaps so obvious before, and that's why I think there is that kind of shift certainly in Britain and other Western societies in the way that environmentalism is being used as a kind of marker of virtue. Are you the right sort of person? You've got the right sort of beliefs, and as a way to kind of distinguish from
the bad guys.
Yeah, the deplorables, or however you want to characterize. Yeah.
And you didn't comment on political movements in Europe.
Oh yes, well I don't know. I'm a bit yeah. Whatever I say probably turn out wrong, but I'm dubious that there'll be a huge rise of Green parties. I don't think so. The Greens have been probably most successful in Germany, but even there it's been relatively limited. In Britain, the Greens have been a constant presence since they started, but very, very small. I mean, if you look at the last recent period just before that Brexit referendum, so the 2015 general election, the three big political parties, the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, said when it comes to the climate, we've got the same policy. We all have the same policy, which is to combat climate change. So if you're the Green Party, what are you going to do? You know, like it's like they've all kind of stolen your clothes. So I'm dubious. Obviously, there is a kind of some support among young people. Yes, it's not an unpopular issue by any means, but I don't think that translates into electoral success in a straightforward way at all.
I think it will be all for today. We exhausted you quite a lot, which I'm really happy for, because I think we really enjoyed in your presentation nowadays. Thank you all for being with us today, and to people who were following this through Zoom. And hope to see you already next, I think, for Thursday and Friday, maybe another also, hopefully very interesting programs, and also one interesting guest from outside, which is rare at this time. Thank you very much, and see you in the future as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks.